Okay, welcome back to week 7, American Literature, a genre study of mystery fiction. So let's start off by wrapping up part 2 of our story, Murder on the Orient Express. So we left off that Ratchet has been murdered. They've starting to notify all the different passengers that Ratchet has met an untimely demise. And Parrot informs Hector McQueen that his late boss was actually the criminal Cassetti, getting back to our Daisy Armstrong / Lindbergh murder kidnapping. And McQueen reacts with surprise and anger, saying that damned skunk. Doesn't sound pretty harsh, but anyway. McQueen reveals a personal connection to the Armstrong case. His father was the district attorney who unsuccessfully prosecuted Cassetti. He even says that he'd have been willing to kill Ratchet himself had he known, but he admits, quote, "Seems I'm kind of incriminating myself." Yes, you would be. McQueen had left the train at one of the stops, but can't remember if he barred the door to the platform on his way back in. Next, Parrot calls Mr. Ratchet's personal valet, Edward Masterman, the sober-minded and proper British man with an inexpressive face. He answers questions about his age and background in clipped phrases with little elaboration. Masterman reports that he had last seen Ratchet at 9 the previous night, and that Ratchet had been upset over a letter he was reading, which was, in fact, another death threat. Ratchet routinely took sleeping medication, which Masterman would give him, as he did the previous night. Finally, Parrot asks Masterman if he is a pipe smoker, but he responds that he only smokes cigarettes. He then, Parrot, then next interview is with Mrs. Hubbard. We've talked about her a little bit. The older American woman who immediately demands to see the person in authority. Today we would call her a Karen. Mrs. Hubbard claims that the murderer was in her room last night. She says she woke to the presence of a shadowy figure and pretended to be asleep, worrying about, quote, "these nasty trains and all the outrages I've read of." Soon she gathered the courage to ring the conductor's bell. After Pierre Michel turned on the lights, they found no one there. Mrs. Hubbard quickly grows impatient with the investigator's skepticism, but she offers a piece of evidence, a button from a train conductor's uniform, which she found near her bed, and is gratified when Parrot accepts it, saying, quote, "That, madam, I call evidence." The plot thickens. Parrot then tells Mrs. Hubbard about Ratchet's connection to the Armstrong case. And while she admits she's familiar with it, calling Cassetti a monster, she doesn't have a personal connection. He follows up on the scarlet kimono, but she denies owning one. Mrs. Hubbard rises to leave, and Perrault suggests she forgot her handkerchief, holding the one with an H found in Ratchet's cabin, but she says it isn't hers. She uses less expensive, more practical handkerchiefs. Perrault then questions Greta Olson whether she's been to America, which she denies. She praises Americans for their financial investment in schools and hospitals. When informed that Ratchet was the man who killed Daisy Armstrong, Greta becomes emotional and leaves crying. After Greta Olson's departure, Mr. Bach asked Perrault to call the Italian man who roomed with Masterman, the valet. Mr. Bach is fixated on the Italian because, as he says, an Italian's weapon is the knife. Before moving on to the next witness, Perrault and Mr. Bach ask Pierre Michel about the button that Mrs. Hubbard found. Pierre flies into a panic when the implication becomes clear to him, but insists that he has not lost a button and finds conductors from the adjacent train cars to vouch for him. Pierre Michel insists that he saw no one else in the hall on his way to Mrs. Hubbard's. This prompts speculation about whether a suspect could have slipped out of Mrs. Hubbard's room between her ringing of the bell and Pierre Michel's arrival. Next is the Princess Dragamov. Although Russian by origin, she now resides in Paris and is on her way home after staying at the Austrian embassy. For much of the previous night, she claims that she was in her cabin with her German maid, Hildegard Schmidt, who massaged her to relieve her arthritis. It emerges that the princess personally knew the Armstrongs through Sonia's mother, Linda Arden. As a result, she finds it entirely just that Ratchet, the man who ruined them, is dead. Perrault also asks the color of her dressing gown, which is black satin. Then the princess leaves, but not before repeating Hercule Poirot's name and declaring, quote, "It's destiny," a remark that puzzles Perrault. The Hungarian nobles, Count and Countess Andrani, are next, but only the Count appears. Perrault insists on her presence anyway. He receives her passport, which reads Elena Maria Andrani, maiden name Goldenberg, and has a spot of grease on it. But the Count and Countess have diplomatic status, which means they don't have to answer questions to anyone about anything. Perrault asks her to sign her name after answering a few questions about her marriage to the Count. He interjects, "By the way, does your husband smoke?" To which the Countess responds that he smokes cigarettes and cigars, but not a pipe. The Countess becomes suspicious when Perrault asks about her dressing gown, but reveals that hers is a corn-colored chiffon. She asks whether he's a Yugoslavian detective, to which Perot replies, "I'm an international detective, and I belong to the world." He then pivots to English to ask if she speaks that language, and she responds that she speaks a little in a heavy accent. Colonel Abutnot is the next witness to be called. Perot finds his French lacking, so he switches to English to speak to him. Gathering basic details, Perot finds him uncooperative, so he becomes more foreign than he need have been to draw him out. Perot likes to play games with people for sure. Perot leans on his connection to Mary Debenham, which the colonel finds highly irregular. Perot tells a white lie that the murderer was most likely committed by a woman, and so he must be especially scrutinizing to all the women on the train. He notes that it's a challenge to deal with the English as they are very reserved. Again, with the stereotypical comments. Perot further implies that the colonel feels warmly in the matter of Mary Debenham, to which the colonel reacts with hostility. Then Perot asks him to cast his mind back, setting the scene by saying, "You smoke perhaps a cigarette, perhaps a pipe?" And Abutnot volunteers that he smokes a pipe. When informed that Ratchet was the man who kidnapped Daisy Armstrong, Colonel Abutnot approves of his death, but he would have preferred that it had happened lawfully. He adds, a trial by jury is a sound system. Back to our number 12. After his departure, Perot sums up the interview, finding it hard to believe that an honorable, slightly stupid Englishman would stab Ratchet 12 times. He insists that one must respect the psychology. The investigators move on to the last of the first-class passengers with the American Mr. Hardman. Mr. Hardman confirms that he's a traveling typewriter ribbon salesman. But on learning Hercule Poirot's identity, he says he better, quote, come clean. He says his true occupation is a private investigator from a respected American detective agency. Hardman volunteers that he knew McQuinn by sight, having had dealings with his father, the district attorney. Next is Antonio Foscarelli. Antonio is not a man who had to have information dragged from him, and he volunteers that he has spent many years in America as a salesman. Antonio largely confirms the story of his roommate, the valet, Mr. Masterman. Mary Debenham is next, and Perot finds her uncooperative, giving non-committal responses to each question or claiming ignorance. Unlike some other passengers, she merely shrugs when she hears the nature of Ratchet's murder and notes that, quote, people die every day. Perot responds that, quote, you are very Anglo-Saxon. This is Debenham recites her recent history as a governess in Baghdad. He also asks her whether she owns a scarlet kimono, and she responds, "No, that is not mine." She reveals she did see someone in a scarlet kimono when she woke this morning at 5, but did not recognize the person. Before she leaves, Mrs. Debenham says that her roommate, the Swedish woman Greta Olsen, is worried that she's a suspect for the murder, as she was the last to see Ratchet alive. Parrot confirms Greta's alibi and tells Miss Debenham that Greta is not a primary suspect. Parrot is confused by the interview with Miss Debenham. He tells Mr. Bach that he believes this was a premeditated crime rather than a crime of passion. Next is Hildegard Schmidt. Hildegard maintains that she doesn't know anything. She says she was called to attend to the princess the previous night. When she notes that she doesn't like to wear a dressing gown in the presence of the princess, Parrot gently interrupts to compliment her scarlet dressing gown, again with the tricky questions. She replies that hers is dark blue. According to Hildegard, after massaging the princess, she returned to her cabin and slept. However, she did see a conductor coming out of one of the compartments and walked swiftly past her in the other direction. The conductor passed her moving towards the dining car, ignoring a ringing bell. Interesting. Asked to describe the man, Hildegard remembers a small, dark man who said, "Pardon me," in a feminine voice. Parrot asks whether the handkerchief found in Ratchet's room is hers. Hildegard responds, no. Parrot, Mr. Bach, and Dr. Constantine take stock of the evidence. They're faced with a small, dark man, a prime suspect who seems to have vanished as he can't be hiding on the train. Seemingly, they're confronted with a missing scarlet kimono and a missing conductor's uniform, one lacking the button that Mrs. Hubbard found in her cabin. To that end, Parrot resolves to search each passenger's luggage. He makes a grandiose prediction that the kimono will be found in one of the male passengers' luggage and the conductor's uniform in Hildegard Schmidt's luggage. As they are wrapping up, Mrs. Hubbard bursts in screaming about a bloody knife in her sponge bag and promptly faints. Parrot carries on with his search of the passenger's luggage while conducting short second interviews with them. Next up is Colonel Abutnot. In the search, Parrot finds pipe cleaners that match exactly the one found in Ratchet's cabin. Abutnot seems untroubled by the focus on the pipe cleaners and notes that he always uses them if he can get them. Parrot searches Hildegard Schmidt's luggage there. True to his prediction, he finds a conductor's uniform with one button missing. Hildegard panics and insists that the uniform isn't hers, and Parrot reassures her, strangely, by saying he's as convinced of her innocence as he is that she's a good cook. This comes into fact later. Parrot notes that the mystery of the scarlet kimono remains a mystery that's difficult because it's been made difficult. Returning to his own bags, Parrot finds in them the scarlet kimono, which he sees as defiance. Yep, I would say you're pretty accurate with that one. Parrot, Mr. Bach, and Dr. Constantine reconvene. Mr. Bach again stresses his confusion with the case and the opinion that none of the passengers' testimony has given any definite evidence, or at least he did not observe it. Parrot responds, quote, "That is because you did not listen." Then Parrot assembles a list of the identities of the passengers, complete with alibis and distinguishing information. Each is vouched for by at least one other passenger, and most have either no motive or no evidence against them. They are of various nationalities. Colonel Abutnot has the evidence of the pipe cleaner in Ratchet's room. The princess has a strong motive, as she was very close to the Armstrongs. To supplement the suspect list, Parrot makes a list of unresolved questions. He notes they haven't assigned ownership of the handkerchief. The scarlet kimono is still an open question, as every female passenger has denied ownership of it, and the precise time of the murder is also in question. Dr. Constantine then raises the issue of multiple murderers acting independently. He cites as evidence Ratchet's wounds, as some are deep and others are superficial, and some suggest a left-handed murderer and others a right-handed one. Parrot reveals that he had invited each witness to write their name precisely to determine whether they were right or left-handed. Only the princess did not participate. Parrot begins to explain the results of his contemplation. He targets a few suggestive details, beginning with the grease spot on Countess Andrani's passport. He connects this to the handkerchief monogrammed with an H. Ignoring the letter for a moment, the elegance and expense of the handkerchief point to two women in particular, the princess and the Countess Andrani. He notes the convenience of the grease spot near the first letter of her name, Elena, and reasons that the grease spot was deliberately placed. And in fact, Parrot deduces that the grease spot was placed to obscure an H after the handkerchief was found. He concludes that Princess Andrani's true first name is not Elena, but Helena. Parrot brings a major constraint on any planned attempt to murder Ratchet, the Blizzard. He reasons that the culprit had planned to depict the murder as an outside job committed by someone who had boarded and left the train at the next station. The existence of the extra conductor's uniform supports this, And Parrot says that if not for the snow, the uniform would be found in the toilet. But since the train was stalled, the culprit or culprits would be shown to be still on the train, complicating the plan. Parrot further recalls that Linda Arden, Sonia's mother, was a stage name, and that her actual surname was Goldenberg. Linda also had another daughter much younger than Sonia. He concludes from this that Countess Elena Andrani is actually Helena Goldenberg, Sonia Armstrong's younger sister. As a result, Princess, who knew the Armstrong family well, must have known Helena was on the train and lied that she had married an Englishman and moved to England. Parrot and Mr. Bach go to the dining car to confront the Count and Countess with this new information. Parrot first offers her the monogrammed handkerchief, which the Countess denies ownership of. But Parrot insists that the monogram matches the first letter of her name, Helena Goldenberg. Against Parrot's evidence, the Countess gives in, and her voice becomes, quote, for the first time, a definitely American voice. The Countess gives an impassioned excuse that Ratchet had destroyed the three people, quote, I loved best and who made up my home, my world. In that moment, she appears a true daughter of the world-famous actress Linda Arden. She explains that she lied because her motive to kill Ratchet was so strong, yet she swears she did not commit the crime. The Count admits his complicity in the deception, saying that the alteration of the passport and luggage was his doing. He offers an excuse that he wanted to protect his wife from false suspicion and media scandal, and that the alteration of the passport was easily done. Parrot gives him back a backhanded phrase. He says, you have the makings of a very fine criminal and an apparently remorseless determination to mislead justice. Alone again, Mr. Bach expresses certainty to Parrot that the Countess is guilty, but Parrot reminds him that there was another opinion for the ownership of the handkerchief. Indeed, the princess enters the dining car to claim ownership of it. Mr. Bach is shocked, objecting that her first name is Natalia, to which the princess responds that the letter N appears as an H in the Russian alphabet. Parrot notes that the princess didn't say the handkerchief was hers, but the princess only answers, you did not ask me. She has no idea how her handkerchief ended up in Ratchet's room, but Parrot suspects she's lying. Parrot turns his attention to Colonel Abutnot. He again confronts Abutnot with the pipe cleaner, but Abutnot is unimpressed and continues to stonewall him. Parrot asks about the ominous conversation with Miss Debenham in Syria. Abutnot refuses to answer. Finding little cooperation, Parrot ventures that Miss Debenham was Countess Andrani's governess at the time of the Daisy Armstrong kidnapping, after there was a, quote, minute's dead silence. Parrot calls for Miss Debenham. Parrot confronts her with the information that she lived with the Armstrongs at the time of Daisy's murder. Mary flinches before recovering and admitting the lie. Mary attributes the lie to the desire to escape scandal so that she could find further employment as a governess. When Parrot continues to press her, she's overwhelmed with emotion, and Abutnot yells at Parrot to leave her alone, threatening to, quote, break every bone in your damned body. They both leave, but not before Abutnot insists that Mary has nothing to do with this, quote, this business. Parrot calls still other passengers into the dining car. Anthony Foscarelli appears. He becomes hostile when Parrot begins questioning him, but relents after Parrot correctly guesses that he was the Armstrong chauffeur. Parrot summons Greta Olson, who immediately admits that she was Daisy's nurse. Masterman, the valet, enters. He admits straight away that he was Colonel Armstrong's assistant in the war and apologizes for his deceit. Mr. Bach and Dr. Constantine marvel at the carousel of emotional confessions and the coincidence of each passenger having a connection to the Armstrong household. Parrot states that he has known for some time who killed Mr. Ratchet, and he asks Mr. Bach to assemble the passengers in the dining car so that he can propose two solutions. Okay, we have a video. I think it's number 10 of 10 from last week, which proposes the two alternative stories. And it is left up to Mr. Bach to decide what they're going to tell the Yugoslavian police. So Parrot sets out the parameters of what they've discovered. Mr. Ratchet was stabbed between midnight and 2 in the morning, and that at 12:30 the train was stopped by a snowdrift. He further states that since no one boarded or left the train in that time, the murderer will be found among the assembled passengers. But then he says that, quote, was our theory, and Mr. Bach exclaims in surprise. Now, in Agatha Christie's stories, this seems to be her typical ending, either it be Parrot or Miss Marple, that all of the suspects somehow are all gathered together at the end, laying out the theories until the proper suspect is either pointed out or admits their guilt. So he sets out the alternative theory in which an unknown assailant was provided with a conductor's uniform, snuck on the train at one of the earlier stops, had a pass key. He entered Ratchet's cabin through Mrs. Hubbard's, stabbed him 12 times with the knife, abandoned the uniform and Hildegard's luggage, and left the train just before it departed. So this is the theory and the evidence that they are going to provide to the police. But we, as the reader, and Parrot, and Mr. Bach, and Dr. Constantine, and all of the passengers know very well what truly happened, that all the passengers are guilty. Okay, so that kind of wraps up our second part of the story, Murder on the Orient Express. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about our comparison of Hercule Poirot and Sherlock Holmes. This is from an article from Community Archive, agathachristie.com, by Rounak, Ghosh, and talks a little bit about Sherlock Holmes uses clues to solve his crimes, but Parrot never really visits the crime scene. He uses his intuitive nature to find out who the culprit is. Holmes would rather solve more crimes than Parrot, but as far as who's the better fit for the job, then Parrot is the better. Holmes also uses drugs to stimulate to help him with his crimes. Both main characters, Holmes and Parrot, use the powers of intellectual deduction to solve crimes. Both also are attended by assistants whom they underestimate and verbally abuse. Both are also intellectual snobs. Holmes is a cocaine abuser and a scientist, while Parrot is just a natural at deduction. Doyle's novels are set in England, while Christie has her characters traveling wherever crime may be. Murder on the Orient Express, Murder in the Mesopotamia, Murder on the Nile, all take place in the Middle East. Both authors are killed off. They're serial detectives and wrote books with other characters. Those of Miss Christie, such as Miss Marple, gained more popularity among readers than Doyle's other books. In literary circles, Doyle is considered an author with a capital A, while Christie was always thought of as merely a commercial successful writer. I personally prefer Christie because her secondary characters are more than just stage dressing for the great man to pontificate before. This is a comment by a reader. Could be a student just like you. Shafra Shamaran. She says, Holmes uses drugs. He doesn't need to indulge when on a case, instead smoking shag tobacco. Parrot has his own luxuries and vices. He's fond of good food, fashionable yet uncomfortable shoes, and Russian cigarettes. It's hard to compare the two on a literary level because Parrot usually appears in novels while Holmes generally appears in short stories. In The Hound of the Baskervilles, he's more of a side character, appearing in the beginning and the end. Personally, I find both very enjoyable. From both, I get a sense of England at their time language, and culture. It's the fact that Perrault cares greatly for the human element. He studies human nature. He makes his stories perhaps more entertaining. Holmes is brilliant and a great performer, but he's cold and analytical. With only Watson to throw warmth and feeling into the story and prevent it from just being a puzzle. Whereas Perrault and Hastings are sympathetic, emotional creatures, not to mention the wonderful cast of characters around them that truly draw us into the story. It ceases to become merely a case, a question, a puzzle to be solved, and becomes instead a human drama. From Muriel N., Catherine Edmond said, Perrault by all means. He's analytical and deductive, but also emotional, with a sense of humor. Holmes is arrogant and humorless. I can't stand him. Catherine, if you call Sherlock Holmes arrogant, you have to admit Hercule Poirot is more than arrogant. No, I'm not playing a tit-for-tat game here. You have to understand that I'm saying, after reading many Sherlock Holmes and Hercule Poirot books, coming to a broader argument, we are here to debate who is a better detective, not who is a better person. If I were to answer that, I would say Sherlock Holmes is better. Let me explain why. I hope I would have no serious objections if I say that the method of investigation used by a detective should be suitable for identifying the perpetrator, whoever he is and wherever he is at the moment. Sherlock Holmes easily wins against Hercule Poirot again here. So why does Sherlock Holmes do? He first talks in detail to the person bringing the sequence of events wanting explanation, visits the scene of the mystery, looks for any forensic clues, analyzes what he finds, traces the unknown, unseen characters, puts his findings about their movements to all of them, and thus jolts the guilty into a confession. This is, in a way, trouble-free, because you need not rack your brains about conflicting testimonies from different characters. You get to see the truth directly. For only those people who don't understand and appreciate the science of forensics, Sherlock Holmes appears as unrealistic, and or Hercule Poirot appears as more realistic. On the other hand, Hercule Poirot's way of reconstructing the crime is suitable only when the perpetrator is within the confinement of the investigation, be it in a house, plane, ship, library, railway coach, or anything. If the criminal is an outsider, as is more often the case in Sherlock Holmes' adventures, and by no means an impossibility in real life, Hercule Poirot would be in a soup for sure. Notice that whenever Hercule Poirot needs to do something outside the confinement, like doing background check, gathering information, tracing people, there's always somebody ready with the objective, reliable, and accurate info on a platter for Hercule Poirot. I often wonder how Agatha Christie fans never realize this. Whereas Sherlock Holmes, too, uses outside agents to help him, but only in situations when he needs to observe the goings-on at more than one place simultaneously. And even then, he tells his agents what exactly to do, meaning it is his brains that does the trick. The only conveniently direct the suspicion back to those inside the confined area, Hercule Poirot asks seemingly logical questions like, whose word do we have for it that there was a man in the corridor? Mystery of the blue train. What evidence do we have for it that it was left in the drawer last night? The submarine plans, etc. In fact, Hercule Poirot's logically suspecting and concluding that the lone testator to anything in the plot is most likely a liar itself, based only on this assumption that valid in a situation where no outsider could have been involved in the affair. And yes, a detective simply ought to be in the midst a lot of travel, action, and thrill and adventure. I would say that a person who feels he can detect without visiting crime scenes is but lazy. But mind you, this is not to say that no mind work need be involved. Frank from Queensland, Australia writes, it's hard to pick between the two detectives. The parallels between Sherlock Holmes and Hercule Poirot are interesting. When Agatha Christie first created her most famous detective, Hercule Poirot, she made no bones of the fact that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's detective, Sherlock Holmes, was a major influence on her work. From this perspective, perhaps Holmes was unknowingly a mentor, guide, and inspiration for the rather vain Hercule Poirot, a trait very much part of Holmes' personality too. In her autobiography, Christie says, at that date, I was well steeped in the Sherlock Holmes tradition, so I considered detectives. Not like Sherlock Holmes, of course. I must invent one of my own. I reviewed such books as I had met and admired in books. There was Sherlock Holmes, the one, the only. I should never be able to emulate him. Both detectives have chivalrous sidekicks who were stereotypical British gentlemen. While Holmes had his able Dr. Watson, Poirot enjoyed the company of Captain Arthur Hastings. Apart from, of course, chronicling the adventures of their famous companions, they also assisted them in field work, sometimes taking the law into their own hands. Watson and Hastings suffered in their role as innocent stooges, as both Holmes and Poirot were conceited and downright rude when in their most uncharitable moods. Vanity was an essential ingredient in the makeup of both Holmes and Poirot, and none could vouch for this more than their two assistants. This vanity was a manifestation of their supreme self-confidence, abetted by years of exercising the little gray cells. And yet there have been times when this confidence has been shaken. The Yellow Face, set in Norbury, and the Chocolate Box stands as the rare failings of Holmes and Poirot, respectively. At one point, Poirot asked Hastings, if at any time you think I'm growing conceited, you shall say to me chocolate box. It is agreed. Just as Holmes once said to Watson, if I should ever strike you that I am getting a little overconfident in my powers, kindly whisper Norbury in my ears. The similarity in both these cases is only too obvious to miss. Of course, along with a stooge assistant, all detectives need a policeman they can outwit. So while Sherlock Holmes had Inspector Lestrade, Hercule Poirot had to contend with Scotland Yard's Inspector Japp. In spite of their self-importance, both Holmes and Poirot were content to let the grateful inspectors take all the credit for solving the cases. For the two detectives, the satisfaction and success of solving a tough case was a greater reward than any public appreciation. Another interesting parallel is that Holmes and Poirot had strong feelings not only for one woman, both of whom were strangely on the other side of the law. While it was Countess Vera Roskakov for Perrault, Holmes was attached to Irene Adler, whom he invariably mentioned not by her name but by the sobriquet of the woman. However, these relationships do not go far, and the two ladies feature in not more than 2 or 3 adventures. A further striking resemblance is their choice of vocation after retirement, which were far removed from the world of crime that the two detectives had been accustomed to. While Holmes famously took to beekeeping and wrote books on the same, Poirot kept himself busy through the cultivation of a vegetable garden. If you have to pick between the two, it would be Poirot by a whisker. Sherlock Holmes versus Hercule Poirot from Books of SuspenseWeebly.com. Sherlock Holmes is a classic detective who used his deduction to solve crimes. It is no surprise that Agatha Christie, the famous mystery writer, used him to write some of her aspects on Poirot, her detective. In this post, I'm going to talk about some of their similarities and differences. Which one is better? Who do you think will solve a case the quickest if you put it together? Let's start with a look at Sherlock Holmes, is known for his classic hat, pipe, trench coat, and magnifier. Poirot wears a hat, a suit, carries a cane everywhere, and oh God, don't forget about the mustache. Both Poirot and Holmes look very intriguing, but the question is who wore it better? Sherlock Holmes looks very classic and serious for his job. Although his outfit is over the top, it still looks like he's going to get down to business. The pipe and trench coat also make him look mysterious, giving this character a three-dimensional look even before you flip the pages. As for Poirot, he looks more comical and just plain over the top. It gives him a lighter feel and a lot more friendly and enjoyable, like something that you would read one late night while it's raining. Poirot is just so suave. I mean, look at him, the cane, the mustache, and the suit. I don't know if I should be jealous of his fashion sense or laugh about how great it suits him. He looks like a human version of Mr. Peanut from the Planters commercial. It honestly makes me expect a funny satire of a mystery novel, which is not what I think Agatha Christie wanted to put out. With that said, Sherlock wins a point. Who is more intelligent? Here we have two masterminds, probably the two best detectives ever. Sherlock uses clues to solve his crime. Parrot never visits the crime scene. He uses his intuitive nature to find out who the culprit is. Parrot is definitely better at understanding people than Holmes. However, Holmes is a better chemist and good with scientific problems. Parrot was able to solve Mr. Ratchett's case without any true evidence, clues, connections, or tracks. Sherlock Holmes relies more on evidence than Parrot. Parrot can also sense when danger is coming. He knew from the second he saw Mr. Ratchett that he wasn't a good man. Holmes would solve more crimes than Parrot, but as far as who is better fit for their job, then Parrot is better. Holmes also uses drugs to help him with his crimes. Parrot never uses drugs in his story. These two are at completely different perspectives at solving crimes. It's honestly like comparing apples to oranges. Sherlock uses science and technology. Parrot uses psychology and logic. It's hard to choose a winner in this division, but I have deducted that Parrot is the winner. Which character is better written? It's time to answer the final question, the mother of all tiebreakers. The question that beats all other questions, which character is better written? Both Arthur Conan Doyle and Agatha Christie are great authors who have dedicated themselves to mystery. Poirot is a great character who dives into a deep world of analysis. He knows the human nature so well, he doesn't even need to look at a crime scene to figure out who the culprit is. He is witty, diverse, and can manipulate the answers out of anyone. His enriching novels make you wonder how accomplished such deductions. At times, he is honestly quite bland, sometimes especially in the novel. I felt as though Christie focused more on the case and how intelligent he was than who he really was. The character development was very slow in Murders on the Orient Express, and it was one of his most acclaimed novels. Poirot is definitely intellectual, but the chemistry and humor I expected from him just wasn't there. He really looked like a bland copy of Sherlock Holmes to me. I have to admit the story was well written, but as for the characters, it isn't perfect. Sherlock Holmes is different, however. He gives off a very mysterious feel without being too preachy about it. His sidekick, John Watson, also gives him an added likability and chemistry. Just watch the show. Sherlock also falls into a dark place with his drug use and his inability to connect with others. Because Sherlock's stories were told from Watson's point of view, it gives him a vague view, what gives readers wanting more. The fact that Holmes was better developed in only 4 novels and 56 short stories in comparison to Poirot's whopping 33 novels, 1 play, and 50 short stories says a lot. Okay, so that's quite a bit. compare and contrast from a variety of different speakers. And I hope this helps you out with your research paper. We'll move on to the next slide from here. Okay, so let's talk about Charlie Chan from crimereads.com, The Birth of American Detective Fiction. The unlikely detectives who would launch a literary phenomena by Leslie Klinger. In 1924, anti-Asian sentiments were at their peak when, with overwhelming support, the United States Congress passed and President Calvin Coolidge signed the Immigration Act, also known as the Johnson-Reed Act. The new law adopted the concept of national origin quotas, limiting overall immigration to 150,000 persons per year, restricting immigration to 2% of the quantity of those nationals already present in the United States, according to the 1890 census, and completely prohibiting the immigration of those ineligible for U.S. citizenship. This last standard effectively barred half the world's population and lumped Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, Indians, Thais, and Indonesians and others into the category of Asiatic. Those Asiatics already living in the United States would be barred from citizenship and prevented from bringing other family members into the country. In 1920, after exhausting himself with work on some very successful stage plays, Biggers traveled to Honolulu. He continued to write a variety of short stories having nothing to do with Hawaii. But he was apparently fascinated by the melting pot that was 1920s Honolulu. And we talked about this in last semester's work about the regional America, when we talked about Hawaii, being that Hawaii is probably the most multinational, multiracial place on the planet. Biggers conceived of a mystery set there, and in 1922 he described the work in progress to his editor as including army people, traders, planters, and Americanized Chinese houseboy, the star pitcher of an all-China baseball nine, the lawyer for an opium ring, an admiral of a fleet, an old Yankee from New Bedford, a champion Hawaiian swimmer, beachcombers, the president of a Japanese bank. But there was no mention of a detective. According to Biggers, in the summer of 1924, he stopped by the New York Public Library reading room, and while browsing through Hawaiian newspapers, he found an account of the Honolulu police. In an obscure corner of the inside page, he found an item to the effect that a certain hapless Chinese, being too fond of opium, had been arrested by Sergeants Chang Apina and Lee Falk of the Honolulu police. So Sergeant Charlie Chan entered the story of The House Without a Key. Biggers was no racial crusader, and he certainly had no intention of creating a Chinese character who would fly in the face of American stereotypes or alter the public view of foreigners. Chan is decidedly different. He is described as a fat man with chubby cheeks of a baby, yet he walks with the dainty step of a woman. He has ivory skin, short black hair, and amber eyes. He does not speak pidgin English, as do several of the Japanese characters in the book. Rather, he speaks his own brand of English. In this respect, he's as foreign as Agatha Christie's Hercule Poirot, whose speech is as distinctive as Chan's. Chan also regularly displays his animosity toward the Japanese, a sentiment common in Hawaii in the 1920s and throughout America. And we talked about this at length also when we talked about the eventual Japanese internment during World War II. Back to our story. In The House Without a Key, though he eventually appreciates Chan's talents, the young Bostonian protagonist cannot erase his sense of a marked gulf between Chan and himself. In this, the author Biggers accurately reflected the realities facing the American people, notwithstanding harsh policies such as the Immigration Act. The ethnic populations of America were here to stay. The adventures of Charlie Chan struck a chord with the Post readership, a national newspaper. Here at last was an American crime writer worth reading, even if his tales were of a slightly less than American detective. First serialized in the Saturday Evening Post between January and March 1925, about the same time as Agatha Christie, the adventures of Charlie Chan struck a chord with the Post readership. Here at last was an American crime writer worth reading, even if his tales were of a slightly less than American detective. The book publication of The House Without a Key occurred in 1925, and over the next 7 years, 5 more Chan novels appeared, all first serialized in the Saturday Evening Post. The Chinese Parrot, Behind the Curtain, The Black Camel, Charlie Chan Carries On, and The Keeper of the Keys. The novels were extremely popular and were adopted into films, cartoons, comic strips, and radio programs. The last Chan film was in 1947, and a cartoon series ran in 1972 and 73. Howard Haycraft, in his masterful Murder for Pleasure, The Life and Times of the Detective Story, 1941, summed up the stories of the Chan series. Quote, "They are clean, humorous, unpretentious, more than a little romantic, and, it must be confessed, just a shade mechanical and old-fashioned by modern plot standards." The absence of any novel or startling departure, in fact, is probably the reason that the first Chan story created no such popular or critical stir as the first Philo Vance case, and it was not until 2 or 3 of his adventures had appeared that he struck full stride. Once started, however, he has been difficult to stop. Conventional as the narratives often were, Charlie Chan's personal popularity played a part in the renaissance of the American detective story that cannot be ignored. Okay, so let's take a quick look at a video, the Charlie Chan discussion. And that's our brief introduction today to the novel series, TV and movie series of America's real first detective series after Poe, Charlie Chan. Okay, so let's talk about our mystery song of the week. And this is from history.com, This Day in History, January 25. And it's about the 1980 arrest of the Beatles singer Paul McCartney. January 25th, 1980, Paul McCartney is released from a Tokyo jail cell and deported from Japan. Paul McCartney arrived at Tokyo's Narita International Airport on January 16th, 1980, which marked his first visit to Japan since the Beatles' tour of 1966. The occasion was a planned 11-city concert tour by his band Wings. Instead, Paul's visit was limited to a 9-day stay in the Tokyo Narcotics Detention Center, which ended on January 25th, 1980. Paul McCartney was found to be carrying nearly half a pound of marijuana in his baggage upon arrival at Narita, an amount that Paul would later assure Japanese authorities was intended solely for his personal use. Well, half a pound of marijuana for personal use would be more than a year's supply of smoking every day. So, Paul, I don't think if you're coming for an 11-city tour that half a pound of marijuana is for personal use. Now, what are you thinking, Paul? You're a famous international singer. You've had run-ins with the British police dealing with marijuana. The Japanese aren't going to just let you walk through their airport and into their country without being severely searched. Well, anyway, I guess that's exactly what did happen. So the amount was large enough, however, to warrant a smuggling charge and a potential 7-year prison sentence. Given Japan's reputation for rigorous enforcement of its strict anti-drug laws, it was by no means a foregone conclusion that McCartney would escape trial and possible imprisonment, yet he was released and quickly deported from Japan on January 25th prior to making any court appearance. Japan is and will be very harsh on any drug offense. They do not want it in their country. That a celebrity of McCartney's stature would avoid the consequences that a less famous drug smuggler might have faced was hardly surprising. After all, who could blame the Japanese authorities for applying a double standard to a prisoner whose sing-alongs inside the jailhouse and screaming fans outside threatened to create a significant distraction from the normal workings of the justice system? The question that troubled the minds of observers at the time was, what was Paul thinking? Yeah, and we just talked about that. What were you thinking, Paul? Half a pound of marijuana was a prodigious amount for one man to carry around for personal use, particularly a man who had reason to expect especially close examination of his person and his baggage by Japanese customs officials. After all, Paul had been denied a Japanese entry visa just 5 years earlier due to his numerous arrests for drugs in Europe. 20 years after his 1980 arrest, Paul would opine that his psychological motivation may have been to find an excuse to disband Wings, which he in fact did immediately following his return to England. In another interview, however, Sir Paul offered an explanation that may be more compelling for its simplicity. We were about to fly to Japan. I knew I wouldn't be able to get anything to smoke over there, McCartney said in 2004. This stuff was too good to flush down the toilet, so I thought I'd take it with me. Big mistake. Okay, so the name of the song is called A Band on the Run by Paul McCartney and his newly formed group after the Beatles broke up, Wings. So let's talk a little bit about the song and the lyrics. This 1974 classic song from ex-Beatle Paul McCartney and friends depicts the narrator's escape from the four walls of a jail cell and the ensuing search party. The song begins with a metaphorical prison, quote, stuck inside these four walls. Where the orchestra comes in is where McCartney envisioned a hole being blasted in one of the walls and the subsequent escape. In 1980, McCartney did actually spend 9 days in a Tokyo jail and faced a possible 7-year prison sentence. Needless to say, there was no escape. Instead, he was merely deported after serving his brief sentence. Paul McCartney explained the song's meaning to the Mail on Sunday's Event magazine. I wrote it as a story to sum up the transition from captivity to freedom. When the tempo changes at Sings, the rain exploded with a mighty crash. I do that in my concert, and that always feels like a freeing moment. Stuck inside these four walls, sent inside forever, never seeing no one, nice again like you. Mama, you. Mama, you. If I ever get out of here, thought of giving it all away. to a registered charity. All I need is a pint a day. If I ever get out of here. If we ever get out of here. Well, the rain exploded with a mighty crash as we fell into the sun. And the first one said to the second one there, I hope you're having fun. Band on the run. And the jailer, man, and sailor Sam were searching every one. Band on the run. Well, the undertaker drew a heavy sigh, seeing no one else had come, and the bell was ringing in the village square for the rabbits on the run. Band on the run. And the jailer man and sailor Sam were searching every one for the band on the run. Well, the night was falling as the desert world began to settle down. In the town they're searching for us everywhere, but we will never be found. Band on the run. And the country judge who held a grudge will search forevermore for the band on the run. Okay, so that was a little bit of information from songfacts.com. So let's take a listen now to Paul McCartney and Wings' song, Band on the Run. Okay, so let's do a quick wrap up of this week's lesson. So we finished off that very complicated story, Murder on the Orient Express. And Parrot, through his use of deduction skills, psychology, and kind of trickery in the way that he asks questions or makes assumptions, getting people to write their names as a way of finding out whether they're right or left-handed, asking questions that are almost accusatory in a way. Oh, tell me about your kimono nightgown, that sort of thing. Just to kind of trick the person into giving themselves away. And again, using Agatha Christie's usual ending style of gathering all of the suspects in a room and providing a theoretical conclusion gets the guilty parties to admit their participation in the crime. So that was kind of an easy read in terms of grammar and English vocabulary, very modern as compared to Poe, and yet a lot more complicated and not as on the scene as Sherlock Holmes would be, going out, tracking things down, finding evidence here and there, putting together his theories. This was basically a mind game reading. And if there were just one or two suspects, it would have been a lot easier to follow, but 12? Come on, that's a lot of pieces of the puzzle to put together. Nevertheless, congratulations, you've made it through probably the most difficult part of the course thus far. From here on out, we will be doing shorter stories like we did in the American Lit 4 course. And we're still going to be touching base a little bit with detective fiction and some of the extra materials. But I think we're going to drift more into the suspense part of mystery fiction. So we're going to be changing gears and point of view from here on out. So additionally, we spent a little more time with the compare-contrast of Sherlock Holmes and Hercule Poirot. Now, between the three of them, again, Augustin Dupin is only in 3 stories. Hercule Poirot, Sherlock Holmes, more than 50 apiece, several novels. So they are really far and away ahead of Augustin Dupin in terms of text and movies and so forth. You may also want to consider, if you looked at the Miss Marple series, of adding her into your research paper as well. That's fine. We'll talk a little bit more next week on the research paper, but just as a quick addition to the compare-contrast, we did take a look at that today. We also looked at the first real American detective series. Poe is the first American detective writer, but the first series of an American detective is actually an Asian American called Charlie Chan, written by Earl de Biggers. And again, relating to the stories we've read so far, his inspiration for Charlie Chan actually comes from an arrest from a newspaper story that happened in Honolulu that connects to Hawaiian and Chinese real-life police detectives. He's writing again about the same time period as Agatha Christie. But Charlie Chan was really America's first series detective and had a long career in text and in the movies, radio programs, comic strips, you name it, Charlie Chan has been there. Excuse me. And finally, we ended up with our mystery song, Band on the Run, by Beatles' Paul McCartney and his group Wings. And the bottom line is of that was we talked about Paul McCartney's arrest in Japan, with the bottom line of being, what were you thinking, Paul? What did you think was going to happen? And he had written a song earlier about being in jail and an eventual escape, and then being a fugitive, being chased. So that's basically what we covered today. Quick word on, for next week, there's no reading assignment because we are going to be switching gears after the consultation week. So start working on your research paper. But there is a video I'd like you to watch for this week's assignment. It's called The Detective is Born, Secrets of Mystery and Suspense Fiction, The Great Courses. And we were introduced to this professor earlier at the start of our course. So this is just one more of his videos. Very well done. Will give you a lot of ammunition that you need for your research paper. And quick word on the research paper. Yep, try to, as usual, try to connect this to something that's of interest to you, if possible. Okay, the research paper format for the written response. Okay, it's a title page, a table of contents page, 2 or 3 pages double spaced of typed text, a bibliography page. You need 3 sources, and you need 3 parenthetical citations with quotes within the text. Now, we've done this before, so I'm going to be a little hard on you. Make sure you follow that format precisely. Any questions, fire me off an email if you're unsure. I do have a video on writing a research paper and citations if you want that link. Another option is instead of doing the written research paper, you could do this with your cell phone and create a video, do an oral presentation. Extra points for that one. And you could even work with another student through Zoom. There is a record option on a Zoom project, and you could submit that as well. Okay, so that's about it for this week. Thanks for watching, and we'll talk to you again next time. Bye.